Last time, towards the end, I was talking about the divisions within Baptists, and remember what kind of brought independent Baptist congregations together was the missionary stuff, and so you had a national body, I guess, the Triennial Convention. And that went on for a few years, but then you started having divisions. And so last time I went through and talked about some of the divisions, such as the Landmarker movement, which was, and this is not strictly chronological, but it's kind of difficult to do it that way here. But J.R. Graves, if you remember, the Landmarkers, their basic belief was that there were a string of, you could have a direct connection of Baptist congregations going all the way back to the day of Pentecost. And they may not have been called Baptist churches, but they were called by different names. Now, J.R. Graves was a Southern Baptist, and he died a Southern Baptist. But after his movement gave birth to what we call the Missionary Baptists, and there's different denominations of Missionary Baptists, and so on. But some of the things that J.R. Graves was influential in Southern Baptists, even though his ideas did not become the majority view, you'll see some of that taste of landmarkism in Southern Baptist churches, the emphasis on closed communion, accepting only baptism from like-minded, so how does it put, from like faith and practice, okay? And so it's beyond just believers' immersion, but it has to be a church that believes in baptism, what do you call it, after a person is saved. So in other words, you might accept like a Bible church that believes in, that's the purpose of baptism and that's why they were baptized, but not another one. And so that many people have that view in Southern Baptist churches. And as I said, when I'm doing this class, I'm not doing this as a doctrinal class where I'm trying to tell you what my views are on all these different doctrines, but just kind of present you what people believe. Now, the reason I would say that J.R. Graves, one of the big reasons for him getting into this was a reaction to Campbellism. And Campbellism was a movement by Thomas and Alexander Campbell, and there were some other people involved in this movement saying, you know, we're restoring the true church, the restoration movement. And also then you had, also during that time you had a lot of the Roman Catholics coming over from Germany and Ireland. And of course, what did the Catholics say? You know, we're the only true church. So kind of as a reaction, some people might say an overreaction, I'll let you make your own judgment of that. That's where we come up kind of the Landmarker movement. Well, you know, we're Baptists are the true church, you know, and so the Landmarkers tended to look at other churches as containing Christians, but not being true churches. And that's sort of the Catholic viewpoint, you know, for example. And out of the Campbell movement that I wanted to say just a few words about in its own thing. Remember, Alexander Campbell was able to pull a lot of entire congregations out of the Baptist orbit and become in his movement. And in the early years, they weren't really settled upon what to call themselves. They called themselves the Christian Church, the Disciples of Christ, Churches of Christ, and they kind of cooperated with each other within this Campbell movement. And
kind of like Campbell soup.
Yeah, and so they were, but they wanted to unite Christianity under the Bible was their slogan. You know, where the Bible speaks, we speak, and where the Bible is silent, we are silent. Well, the thing is, you can trying to unite everybody under the Bible. The problem is people have different interpretations of what the Bible means, and so their effort to try to unite all Christians in one thing wound up really creating another denomination. Now, at first, as I said, they kind of went along together, and over the years, there was no split in the sense that you could pinpoint the day that they split. They were recognized in 1906 as two separate things by some group that keeps track of, denominations and all that, but it had already occurred. And that split was one group became the Disciples of Christ, and you'll see this a lot of times. It says Disciples of Christ parentheses Christian Church, because sometimes they're called Disciples of Christ, sometimes they're called Christian Church, and so they believed in a lot of the views of the Campbell movement. And then you had the more conservative, if you will, I guess a bit one way of putting it would be the Churches of Christ. And does anybody know what was the biggest point of contention between the Disciples of Christ and the Churches of Christ? There were other things, but the biggest thing was instrumental music. So some began to use instrumental music. The Campbells did not believe in instrumental music. You go to a Church of Christ and they have a cappella. They sing without any pianos, organs. Instruments. Yeah, any kind of instrument. And for example, there was a woman in my carpool years ago when I first started teaching. Real nice woman, and we got along fine. And she was a Church of Christ young woman, and we were talking about the instrumental music, and I said, well, in Ephesians it says to, have songs and spiritual songs and hymns and psalms, sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. And I said a psalm is a song that's sung with musical accompaniment, and it comes from the word to pluck. So it's essentially a stringed instrument, that you would play. And she says, no, you pluck your vocal cords is what you do. And I said, and I just kind of threw a hand. I laughed, but we got along fine.
But don't use the Old Testament.
That's right, and that's the thing is their view is that the demarcation is that anything is in the Old Testament is good for lessons in history and that sort of thing, but as far as what a Christian is bound by is the New Testament. And anyway, that became those two movements, and there's even an instrumental Church of Christ today. There's a few Church of Christ congregations that will have instrumental music. And then within the Church of Christ, there's even a smaller division called the One-Cuppers. And they believe that you should use only one cup in communion and pass it around. I'm not going to go there during flu season, there's no doubt about that. But, they think they're hardcore. They think the other Churches of Christ are going to hell. Okay, that they're the only ones and everything. They're very small, so it's going to be a small group. Narrow is the way, and that one cup's the way, I suppose. But over the years, the Churches of Christ have kind of evolved, I think, over the last 30, 40 years. They're a little more mainstream than they used to. They accept other people as Christians. The vast majority do now. But anyway, so I kind of discussed Campbellism as part of, when talking about Baptists, the divisions. And another division we talked about last time was the anti-mission movement that really pulled away a lot of Baptists, the hard shell or primitive Baptists, hyper Calvinists. In other words, they believe everybody's destiny is already determined, and so therefore there's no reason to actually share the gospel with anybody. Even though the Great Commission says to do that, they say, what's the point? And I guess, I say there's some logic to that, I guess. But still, they were commanded to do it. And of course, then we had the sectional divisions, which we could spend a lot of time on that. That the Southern, the Baptist split, and I've heard it said they split over slavery. Well, that's kind of oversimplified. What they split on was, could a slave owner serve on boards and commissions of the national denomination? And the northern brother, he introduced a resolution to keep them from doing that, and our southern brothers didn't go for that very much. So 1845, we have the Southern Baptist Convention is formed, the Northern Baptist Convention is formed, and they agreed to go their separate ways. And it was a rather amiable split. The problem that developed over time was that as we get into the 20th century and people start moving around, and a lot of Southerners began to go to places like Detroit and Ohio and places like that looking for jobs, they didn't like, by this time they were called American Baptists. The Northern, even though the agreement was neither one would take the name American Baptist, those Northern Baptists, they decided to take the name American. And a lot of Southerners didn't like the American Baptist churches, so you started having Southern Baptist churches in the North and so forth. And okay, and then now looking at one more thing, the Free Will Baptists really were not a split. Is that they never really became part of this like triennial convention. Because most of the early Baptist churches were more Calvinistic in probably a milder form, I guess you might say, and everything. Well, and so what you had is there were two distinct groups called Free Will Baptists. There was a northern group and there was a southern group. And the northern group was led by a man by the name of Benjamin Randall, and therefore Randall University up in Moore. And the southern group was led by a man by the name of Paul Palmer. And so these two groups pretty much had they were basically the same. It's just that one group was in the north and one group was in the south. And I'll say Benjamin Randall was one of the last converts of George Whitefield, like just a few days before Whitefield died. And it's interesting, Whitefield was Calvinistic, but Benjamin Randall was a Calvinistic Baptist preacher, and then he changed his mind. Well, then what happened is in the north, the Free Will Baptist movement declined, and a lot of Free Will Baptists joined the Northern Baptist Convention after the split in the Southern and Northern. And then some Free Will Baptists that didn't want to be part of the Northern Baptist Convention went together with the Southern wing and formed the General National Council of Free Will Baptists. So that's kind of how they got going. And one thing in addition to their doctrines on salvation that kind of is distinctive about Free Will Baptists is the foot washing. Yeah, you may have heard of that when they take the Lord's Supper. I don't know that they do this every time they take the Lord's Supper, but they have foot washing ceremonies because Jesus washed the disciples' feet at the Last Supper. And
Pentecostals do too.
Yeah, as I was going to say, some other groups do as well. And then we were talking about the Sunday School Board of the Southern Baptists. Created a Sunday School Board in 1863, Basil Manley and John Broadus. And so the publishing arm became known as Broadman for these two guys. But here's the importance of the Sunday School Board, and this is one of the reasons that Southern Baptists were successful, is they came up with literature that people were not trained in Bible study, like seminary. You didn't have a lot of helps that you have today that people can go to. You couldn't go to Mardell's back in the 1800s and everything. So what they did is they would send out literature to member churches in the Southern Baptist Convention. And so some old guy out here in Alabama or Oklahoma or wherever they were going to be, it would help teachers, Sunday school teachers, teach little kids or teach adults. And I would say that's another thing that helped Southern Baptists grow, is that they had Sunday school for adults. And why does that make a difference? Because I think a lot of people, they go to these churches, these big churches, and they just have no connection with anybody else. They sing a lot of songs and they hear some preaching and all that, and it's over with. And that's one of the strengths of not just Southern Baptists, obviously, but that was something they really put a lot of emphasis on Sunday school, including adults, not just children. And so,
great for fellowship.
Great for fellowship, like we're going to have a fellowship on Saturday at 3 o'clock, right here in this room, right? Okay. So, and of course, Baptists were known even then for meeting and eating, and so forth. Okay.
The Baptists made it a point that everyone teach on the same subject.
Mm-hmm.
The Pentecostals, they have their own literature, but the churches don't enforce everybody teaching the same subject.
Yeah.
So that you don't know what you're going to get taught when you go into the Sunday school class.
Yeah. So keep that in mind, kind of put that to the side about the Sunday School Board was created with the literature, because we're going to come back and talk about that because that's going to become another issue later on. Now, after, in 1859, it was determined that you needed a more educated ministry. And so the first seminary was formed, partly a couple of reasons. One is so many of the seminaries in America had gone liberal, had been infected by what we would call liberalism, and that type of thing. And secondly, Southern Baptists wanted a seminary that would focus on Southern Baptist doctrine. So the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary was formed in Greenville, South Carolina in 1859, and then it moved to Louisville, Kentucky in 1877. And that was the first. And you might have heard the name Lottie Moon. Lottie Moon was one of the first Southern Baptist missionaries, and she went to China, and when she got there, T.P. Crawford and his wife and Lottie Moon were the only American Baptist missionaries in all of China. And Lottie Moon was like 4'8". She was a real tiny woman and everything. And she was engaged to one of those Southern Baptist Theological Seminary professors. And she said, "Well, I'm going to go to China." And Moon and I'm trying to think of his name. Crawford Toy, that's it. Crawford Toy, the guy she was engaged to, he was going to go get some additional study. He was on the faculty at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he was going to get some additional study at Tübingen Seminary in Germany. And he goes over there, and Tübingen Seminary in Germany taught things like Well, the Bible's full of errors. It has a lot of fables and myths and all that kind of stuff, and we all evolved from lower forms of life and stuff like that. And he comes home, and he starts talking with Lottie Moon, and she breaks the engagement. And Crawford Toy, he just kind of floats along then. But anyway, Lottie Moon, she was quite a woman. Back at that time, you had to go raise your own support. Even though she was commissioned by the Southern Baptist Convention, she had to go and visit all these Southern Baptist congregations and trying to get support. And so she went to this one congregation, and she'd have all her Chinese stuff, and she wore this Chinese clothes, and she was showing some food, and all this. And some guy in the congregation stood up and he says, "Well, Miss Moon, it seems to me that a woman's place is in the home, and that you really shouldn't be out there on the mission field without a husband, there and everything." And she says, he sat down and she said, "Fine," says, "I'll stay here and you can go over to China and take my place." And he said, "Well, I don't want to do that." And she goes, "Okay, then I'll go back over there." So it was Moon that suggested that Southern Baptist women devote a week of prayer and offering for foreign missions in connection with Christmas. That's why, we had the Lottie Moon Christmas offering. And the irony of it is she gave way. There was a lot of famines in China and that sort of thing. The joke was, that's not a real funny joke, but why did they not have any cats in China? It's because their devotion to their pet decreases as their hunger increases. Well, she would be sent food and that sort of thing, and she just kept giving it away. She saw hungry Chinese, and she was malnourished. She was dying. And they finally convinced her to come home to America, and so she gets on the boat, and I think she got as far as Tokyo, and she died on Christmas Eve, which is kind of ironic, the Christmas offering and all that. They also, the Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary was the second one. It was established in Waco, Texas, as part of Baylor University in 1901, and it was moved to Fort Worth in 1910. Then you had, they say, well, what we need is to encourage young men and women to see the importance of missions. Because after all, that's why we have a national convention. That's the number one reason. And so the WMU, the Woman's Missionary Union, was formed in 1888. That used to be a big deal in Southern Baptist churches. Annie Armstrong was the first corresponding secretary. So there we have it used to be called Home Missions, and I think it's called North American Missions now, offering and named in her honor. But this missionary education would start with children. They called it the Sunbeam Band. Some of you may have remembered the Sunbeams, and they had Order of Royal Ambassadors, and they said, well, we need something for girls, and so they had the Girls Auxiliary. So you had the RAs, you had the GAs, and that was formed in 1913. And that's kind of faded, partly because I think that it's just really hard to get people to go out and and help with these. It takes a lot of time, outside of just Wednesday nights and so forth. But I was in RAs. I was in what they called the Crusaders. I was a page, and then I was a squire, then I was a knight. I remember that and all that kind of stuff. And that's where I learned about Lottie Moon, and so forth. College work. It was also decided that Southern Baptists need to get into the colleges, the secular colleges, and so they started what were called Baptist Student Unions, and I think they've changed. They always want to change the name. I'm not making it. I'm just saying the names are always changing. It's hard to keep up with it. I think it's called Baptist College Ministries or something like that now, and so that started in 1914. These BSUs, and I remember going to the BSU, and I was in college. Okay, now I kind of already mentioned about the Southern Baptists expanding outside of the borders of the Old South, like into places like Ohio, was I think the first place this came to be an issue, because the only thing that separates Kentucky from Ohio is the Ohio River, you know, and so a lot of people in northern Kentucky would cross the river and get jobs there in Cincinnati. And so they formed churches. And then they applied for membership in the Southern Baptist Convention. And this set off a controversy because our northern brethren said, whoa, wait a minute. This is our territory, you know. And they said, well, these people, they want to join. They don't want to be Northern Baptist Convention people. And so eventually both sides agreed, just open it up, you know. And so really Southern Baptist is a misnomer, in the sense that Southern Baptist is way beyond the South now. There are some people that act like there ought to be something, and I cannot understand this, you know. It doesn't stop me from using northern tissues, you know, or anything like that. I don't understand why people get so care whether it's called Southern Baptist or North, you know, and all that, but there are people like that. One of the biggest battlegrounds, if you want to call it that, between Northern Baptists and Southern Baptists, the biggest battleground was Oklahoma, Indian Territory. You had missionaries from both sides that came into Oklahoma to the various Indian tribes. And so when the Baptist congregations in Indian Territory first formed, they decided, okay, it was right before statehood, and they said, well, they just called it the Baptist General Convention of Oklahoma. If you've ever wondered why it's not called the Southern Baptist Convention of Oklahoma, that's why. It was neither Southern Baptist or Northern Baptist. It was made up of both American Baptist congregations and Southern Baptist congregations, and eventually, as more and more people moved into Oklahoma from the old southern states like Arkansas and Texas and Alabama and so forth, the Southern Baptists won out, so to speak. And so in 1914, the Baptist General Convention became one of the state conventions in the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, I've covered a lot of material there real quick. Does anybody have a question or a comment? More divisions then. As we get into the early part of the 20th century, and I kind of touched on this a little bit with the Crawford Toy, Lottie Moon engagement and then breaking up in the Southern Baptist Seminary and all that, is the liberal fundamentalist controversy that came into American Christianity in the last part of the 1800s and first part of the 1900s. Southern Baptists were not as affected by that as many other denominations, but there was a pastor in Fort Worth, Texas, named J. Frank Norris, who he was certainly not part of the liberal side of the controversy. Okay, he started the Baptist Bible Union of America. He was a Southern Baptist pastor. He was pastor of the First Baptist Church of Fort Worth. He was quite, see how I put this. He knew how to make news. And he would say things and do things to attract interest, and he would make the news and all the newspapers and that sort of thing. He would put out ads in the Fort Worth newspaper. He said, I'm going to talk Sunday about 6 men who are being unfaithful to their wives, prominent men in Fort Worth. And he'd had these huge crowd would show up, and he wouldn't say a word about it, you know. and so I don't know if that's quite. I wouldn't advise that as a good way to do it, but
At the time, didn't it?
do what now?
It worked real good at the time.
Yeah, he's probably one of the few Southern Baptist pastors that ever had a situation where he was alleged to have killed a man in his office. Now, he said it was in self-defense. He was in his office and a guy came in and J. Frank Norris, he kept a gun in his office and he killed the guy. And so it's kind of one of these things we don't know exactly what. I guess only J. Frank Norris and the dead guy knew, and of course Norris is dead now too. But he eventually moved away from the Southern Baptist Convention. It was J. Frank Norris that got Southwestern Seminary moved from Waco to Fort Worth. And he was an important figure in the Southern Baptist Convention at that time. But he challenged the use of literature from the Sunday School Board. He said that that was, that was kind of adding to scriptures by having literature. And so out of this came the Bible Baptists. You may have heard of Bible Baptists before. And so that was how they got started. And of course, if you go into the office of a Bible Baptist preacher today, you're probably going to see commentaries up on there, But for some reason, Sunday school literature was a no-go. You can't have that. And
He's the one that he preached a message on two men from outer space. Come Sunday, I'm going to tell you who they are.
See, that's what I'm saying. He would do things like that, and the Baptist Faith and Message was adopted in 1925. It was the first Southern Baptist statement of beliefs, and to clarify Southern Baptist theological positions, and it has been revised a few times since then. The second version was a result of the Ralph Elliott controversy in 1962 over the Broadman Bible Commentary. Remember Broadus and Manley? Remember those two guys? The Broadman Publishing. And so what Southern Baptists thought they would have is something that would help preachers and Sunday school teachers would have a commentary on the entire Bible, that they could use. And Ralph Elliott was assigned to write the commentary on Genesis. That's where it stopped. The first volume was considered too liberal, and that was a big controversy. So they said, well, we need to go back and revise the Baptist Faith and Message, and then we have the Pressler-Patterson conservative strategy. That was in the 70s. To elect, the way the Southern Baptist Convention is set up, we elect a president. And the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, he gets so many appointments, so many of the boards and commissions. Like you've got the Sunday School Board, you've got the Foreign Mission Board, now called the International Mission Board, you got the North American Mission Board, you've got the board that's over all the seminaries and so forth. And so it was determined that our literature was getting too liberal and the seminaries were getting too liberal. And so Paige Patterson and Paul Pressler, now Patterson was a minister and Pressler was a layman, he was a lawyer. And they met over coffee. So it wasn't, I don't think it was Starbucks, coffee, but they met over a cup of coffee and they decided this is the strategy, that we're going to start electing conservative presidents who will make appointments to all these boards and commissions and cause a shift. And it took probably 10, 15 years, and the shift did happen. and so on. So now what happened as a result of that is another division. The Cooperative Baptist Fellowship broke away and formed their own sort of thing. And if you may have, if you go drive out on Norman on West 36th, it's North Haven, I think it's called, Baptist. That's a Cooperative Baptist Fellowship church. And another deal, of course, is the resurgence of Calvinism within this SBC. One thing that has not really divided Southern Baptists, however, is eschatology, the doctrine of last times, because Southern Baptists historically never really had one set view on that. So you've got premillennial Southern Baptists and you've got all millennial Southern Baptists and so forth. But it's never been a big division thing. Now, if you go to like the Assembly of God and a lot of the Pentecostals, they have their creeds or confessions or so forth. It'll be in there, dispensational premillennial, and that will be part of their doctrine, And the reason for that is they came along at a time when that was kind of at the high tide, so to speak, that viewpoint. So you can go around the Southern Baptist Convention and you'll see a lot of people in the same church have different views on eschatology, but it's not a real division thing. Now, let's talk about the cooperative program. And this is the marvel of the evangelical world, so to speak. And I have talked to people who have been on mission fields, and they will say that missionaries from other denominations will come up to them and say, I wish we had the cooperative program that you have. And this is something that was launched in 1925 in addition to, the way it used to be, like Lottie Moon, she had to go around congregation to congregation and raise money, and practically everybody else does it that way. And so they decided that instead of doing that, you're going to give money to these missionaries, why don't we just make it where you give to the Southern Baptist Convention, to the cooperative, and it goes to the cooperative program, and so they're commissioned by the Southern Baptist Convention anyway. And so when you put money in the offering plate, a certain percentage goes to Nashville. It goes to wherever the foreign mission deal is, and the home missions and so forth. And it's divvied up, and we put missionaries on the field. And missionaries don't have to worry then about where their next money is going. They can They can dedicate their time to the mission field, and it's and then of course bookstores is another part of the Southern Baptist Convention. They used to be called the Baptist bookstores. Once again, they felt like they needed to change the name, and now they're called Lifeway. And I know there's a Lifeway store up on Northwest Expressway in Oklahoma City.
Didn't there used to be one there on 240?
There did. And now, annual convention is the same as the name of the denomination. It's the annual convention is called the Southern Baptist Convention, is the same name as the denomination. One thing that is important to note is that people who go to the Southern Baptist Convention are not called delegates, because what does the word delegate mean? You're giving the power to make decisions affecting the whole organization. Well, the Southern Baptist Convention does not tell any church in the Southern Baptist Convention what to do. Every church in the Southern Baptist Convention is independent. in all its major decisions, who its officers are going to be, even isn't even a set amount of money to give to the Southern Baptist Convention. All I don't know, I may be wrong on this, but I think if you just give just a handful of dollars, you're in the Southern Baptist Convention, and so some churches give a lot to the Southern Baptist Convention, and some don't give very much at all. But that's how it is. But what I'm saying is, the structure of the Southern Baptist Convention is you've got the local congregation, and they go together with your local association. And does anybody know what our association's called? Union Baptist. Okay, and there's 60, 70 churches in this area that are in the Union Baptist Association. And we have a person who's Preston Collins, who's a member of our church. He's not the bishop, or anything like that, but he does assist churches within the association. Like if somebody's without a pastor, he'll give them his recommendation. But it's not like other denominations where he just places somebody in here as the pastor. And so the association will do various things as well. And then you have your state Baptist conventions. Now some states have so few Southern Baptist churches that they go together with other, like North and South Dakota, I think, are one convention. But I think there's Southern Baptist work in all 50 states now. Now, outside the South, this question about Southern Baptist Convention has been an issue. I know that people in the North they're not going to be prejudiced or anything against something with Southern in the name, but the option has been afforded, so to speak. If you want to call yourself a Great Commission Baptist, you can do that. But that's just an alternative name to Southern Baptist that is used by some Southern Baptist churches outside of the South. Today, the Southern Baptist Convention has around 16 million members and 44,000 churches, 1,200 local associations, 41 state conventions, sends out thousands of missionaries, but unfortunately, like the rest of Christianity, there has been decline. Baptisms have declined from what they used to be. So, okay, let's look at non-Baptists. We've talked about the Baptists here for a while. Let's look at some of the non-Baptist American Christianity. I've mentioned a little bit about the Sunday school. The rise of the Sunday school was actually in England in the 1750s. And the original idea behind the Sunday school was that it was to teach little kids to read. And so, a lot of them are working in like textile mills and stuff like that during the week, and they didn't really have school. They weren't going to school, and so they would set up these schools in the mills on Sunday, and a lot of times the churches would come in and teach these little kids using the Bible how to read, and so a lot of that there's kind of a natural evolution, if you will, there to. As we get further along in the Industrial Revolution and these kids are no longer in the textile mills and that sort of thing, they found that that's a great way to reach people. Samuel Slater, who brought the Industrial Revolution to America, he was a worker in a textile mill in England, and they wouldn't let you take a machine out of England, so he memorized the machine. And he just came over and opened his own textile mill in Rhode Island, and so he started a Sunday school there. Baptist layman B.F. Jacobs developed a uniform lesson plan by the 1800s to kind of help people teach little kids. And they found out that in the 19th century, 1800s, 80% of all new church members were introduced to the church through the Sunday school. And, I would say that's probably pretty well true today, that the majority of people are reached through the Sunday school. The Nazarene Church branched out of Methodism over the question of holiness. Remember, we talked about the Wesleys, and the Methodist Church grew out of the Wesley movement. Now, John and Charles Wesley died Anglicans, but people who liked what they were doing start the Methodist Church now. And then as we get further along, there's some people who decide, the Methodists are just getting too liberal, and so they need to start a more conservative, and so the Nazarenes are basically Methodists. Okay, they go back to the original Methodist deal. Only what was the thing that John Wesley emphasized, remember, was the holiness. And so this perfection idea. Not that John Wesley literally thought you could become perfect. He means more mature. Okay, victory over sin, and I guess he's really right. You don't have to sin. You are going, it's inevitable, but there's no requirement. And I would say that there was a guy named Watchman Nee. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of him. He wrote a book called The Normal Christian Life. And one thing I remember out of the book was that it's normal for a Christian to obey God. It's not typical, but it is normal. In other words, that's the way it's supposed to be. Like you expect what do you expect a washing machine to do? Wash clothes. If it's, let's say that it's, just because a majority is doing something another way doesn't mean that's, normal and majority is not the same thing. Normal is the way it's supposed to be. And so the Nazarenes basically had the same beliefs essentially as the Methodists, only they emphasized the holiness, the original Wesley movement. Unitarians, they come along in the last part of the 1700s, early into the 1800s, and they question the doctrine of the Trinity. They believe that Jesus was of God, but he wasn't God. And they believe that Jesus died on the cross for our sins, and and all that. But they denied that the what do you call it, the doctrine of the Trinity. They just didn't believe that way.
So I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So what did they believe?
One God.
Jesus was.
He is the Son of God, that God created him. They believe he was the first creation, and so to speak. And
they were a lot like the Jesus only movement.
Yeah, and so they denied the Trinity in the early years. They weren't that much different than the rest of Christianity, except on that. In fact, it was a Unitarian that wrote the great Christmas hymn, "O Holy Night." That's one of my favorite Christmas hymns, And they taught but as the years go by, they become increasingly less orthodox, so to speak. They taught the perfectibility of man. Part of the Unitarian thing was probably, I think, an overreaction to Calvinism. Where Calvinism, you're born with a sin nature and all that kind of stuff. Well, they believe you could become perfect. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau were examples of Unitarians. But as the years went by, they became less and less biblical, and today they evolved into our modern deal called the Unitarian Universalists. And at Randall we're going to be having William Murray, who was the son of the famous atheist Madalyn Murray O'Hair, come in September. And I've read his autobiography, and when he was struggling as he got to be an adult, he had a lot of emotional problems, as you can probably imagine. He was trying to figure out what was right, so he thought, well, I'll go to church and just see what it is, and he winds up, first one he goes to is a Unitarian, and the Unitarian tells him, he says, well, you're just going to have to solve your problems on your own, because there's probably not even a God to talk to, That was his first deal. But anyway, I want to emphasize, though, that at first, yes, they were wrong on that doctrine, but they still believed in most of the rest of biblical Christianity at first. Modernists denied the historical truth of the Bible. At one time, Princeton Seminary was a typical. It would be much different in, our Southern Baptist seminaries, and they were Presbyterian and very biblical, but they went the way of the modernist thing, as they called themselves. They fired one of their more illustrious professors, J. Gresham Machen, simply because he believed in the inerrancy and infallibility of the Bible. He couldn't stay on staff there in believing that way. Louis Sperry Schaeffer and others founded the Dallas Theological Seminary with a strong evangelical and dispensational emphasis. And so I'll say just a little bit about that. In the early 1800s, there was a guy named Darby, and he was not the first person to believe in what we call the rapture, pre-tribulation rapture of the church. There had been others that had believed that that's what the Bible taught, but he was kind of the first guy to kind of create a system, where he kind of outlines the way he thought it would work. And so in the 1800s, this view, the dispensational premillennial view that, there's a lot more to dispensational premillennial than the pre-tribulation rapture of the church, but I don't have time to go through all that. But that view was not welcome in seminaries, okay? So what happened was that preachers and laymen who believed in the dispensational premillennial viewpoint started having what they call Bible conferences. And another purpose of the cause of the Bible conferences was how the seminaries, so many of them were going liberal, okay, that we talked about. And so that move, and that was eventually had more impact upon churches than the seminaries were having upon churches. And so a lot of people began to get their preachers out of these Bible conference movement, deals, instead of out of seminaries. And so they came out of that with this dispensational premillennial viewpoint. Now, a couple of people that adopted this view, one you may have heard of, Dwight L. Moody. Dwight L. Moody was a dispensational premillennial guy, and he did not create the YMCA, but he used it to reach. You want to do that again? At the YMCA. Okay. But what he saw was, because of the Industrial Revolution, you had these cities like Chicago and New York City and Philadelphia and so forth that were growing, and you had people coming to the cities to get these jobs, and the populations were increasing. You had immigrants coming over from Eastern Europe, and you had all this stuff going on, and so you had all these unchurched people. And there simply weren't enough churches in these towns to reach all these people, and you couldn't get a lot of these people to come to church. And so they thought, well, sort of like the Sunday school. Here's one thing that happens with Sunday schools: is you get little kids to come to Sunday school, and a lot of people say, "Oh yeah." They come by and we'll take your kids to Sunday school, and they say, "All right, we're going to be without the kids for a couple hours, and all that." And eventually, the kids come home; they're so excited, they're talking about Jesus and everything, and their parents wind up going to church as well. And that's one of the things. Well, what Dwight L. Moody did, the way he used the YMCA, was, what do they do at the YMCA? Well, they do a lot of fun stuff, don't they? And a lot of athletic activities and games and all that kind of stuff. And so while they were there, the Young Men's Christian Association, they would teach them the Bible. They would teach them the gospel. And so that became something that Dwight L. Moody was really big on. The person probably most responsible for the popularity of the dispensational premillennial view was a guy named Cyrus Scofield. And he came up with the Scofield Reference Bible, which really popularized the dispensational premillennial view. Scofield was, when he was a little kid, what he would do is, like somebody would say something about, say, a country, okay? And so he would start going and digging at every little detail he could come up with about that country, and he'd start kind of putting it all in a, write it down and all this kind. You can see where this is headed, But he went to, he was a lawyer, and in Kansas, he was a Tennessee farm boy, and they moved to Kansas and became a lawyer there in Kansas, and so on, and was a very good lawyer. But he had developed a drinking problem, and he lost his wife, left him, and with the kids, and he got into some sort of he was a politician. He was a state senator, I think, for a while, and got into some sort of scandal, and there's some dispute whether he actually spent time in jail, and all this kind of stuff. But he was at a pretty low point in his life when a friend came by to see him, and he told him, he says, "What you need is Jesus Christ." And so, to make a long story short, that's what he eventually did. He did accept Jesus, and that stopped the drinking. It stopped everything. But now but his wife had left him. They're divorced. He eventually remarries, and he is asked to do some lessons, and he really liked it, and he wound up like he wanted to be a preacher. Felt like God was calling him to preach, and he went to Dallas, and he was a Congregationalist, and he went to the First Congregational Church of Dallas. Now that sounds like a big job, doesn't it? Oh man, First Congregational Church of Dallas. But the thing is, that is a Yankee denomination, which was not real popular in the aftermath of the Civil War, okay? And so he had 14 members when he went there. Within a couple of years, he had 500 members, and people were coming there. And he was asked one time to preach so I'm trying to think what you'd call it, Memorial Day, okay, like a Memorial Day type thing. And so he said, "Well, okay, I'll do that." And so he put it on his calendar. Well, then it was like for the Confederate veterans, because he was a Confederate veteran, and he was from Tennessee. And then later, the Union people asked him to speak to a deal for them, and he said, "Sure, And he went back to his office, and he looked at his calendar, and it was this exact same time as the Confederate deal. He thought, "Oh no, what am I going to do here?" And this wasn't very many years after the Civil War, and so he went to the two guys, and I think he invited them to dinner or something, and he says, "Look, guys, here's my problem. And do you think we could just have the meeting at the joint meeting?" And they said, "Well, they were fine with it, but we don't know what the boys will think." Now, they're boys, they're 50-year-old men, but they're boys. We don't know what the boys will think. Well, the boys went for it. And so they came in there, and they're all together, and he preaches an evangelistic sermon, and several of them get saved. And so anyway, well, the story at Scofield, that little deal I was telling you about, wanting to have every little fact about a country and everything, he did the same thing with the Bible. He would take it apart and say, like, he would find something in the Bible, and then he'd go all over the Bible, everywhere where it says something about that, and he started, doing all that. And so out of that was the Scofield Reference Bible eventually came about. He didn't write the Scofield Reference Bible to advance dispensational premillennial view. That's just what he believed, and so that's what he put in there. But it was such a popular Bible that it became so associated with conservative, because he was an associate of Dwight L. Moody, and they were kind of part of the anti-modernist, movement, that this was the Bible that was used by so many preachers all over America that it became, in all denominations, it became a very popular reference Bible. Another person during this kind of same time period was Billy Sunday. Now, Billy Sunday was a professional baseball player, very good professional baseball player, and but he got an injury and he retired from the baseball field, and he became a Christian, and he began preaching. And Billy Sunday was very popular. What he would do is he would put on a show. Okay, people would show up, and it'd be like in an auditorium, and he's going to preach, and people, and he was a big name. It'd be sort of like today. I'm trying to think of, let's say if some famous athlete retires and he becomes a preacher, people would go to hear him just because he was a great athlete or something like that. That's the type of deal. Okay. And there weren't a lot of things to do for entertainment back then. So a lot of people would go to just be entertained by the preacher. And so Billy Sunday, you'd come in, you'd be sitting there, and there'd be a pulpit, and this is a stage, like they'd have plays and stuff up on the stage. Well, Billy Sunday would come from the side, and he'd be running, like in his baseball uniform, and he'd be running, and he would slide right into the pulpit, and then jump up, and he goes, "I'm safe." He goes, "But are you safe?" And then he'd take off from there, and people would say, "Hey, did you hear what Billy Sunday did? He's going to be preaching tonight," and people would go to hear him.
But he was a fantastic evangelist.
He was fantastic. I mean, he was very, very effective, very popular, and very. Charles Finney. Now let's go back a little earlier in the 1800s. Charles Finney was part of what we call the Second Great Awakening. Remember the First Great Awakening with George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. Well, Charles Finney, he was a postmillennialist. Okay, now what that means? Okay, the premillennialists, they believe that Jesus will return and set up a 1,000-year reign or millennium. The postmillennialists believe that the church is going to conquer the world, and things are going to get better and better and better and better and better. And then Jesus says, "Well, it looks like it's good, And I'm not trying to put it down or anything, but I'm ready to come back now. Okay, so now think about this. Before Jesus is going to come back, the world's going to have to get to a certain point. So if you're acting ugly, and you're holding Jesus from coming back, and that caused a lot of resentment by a lot of people towards those. And Charles Finney believed that the church should attack the evils of society. He attacked slavery, drunkenness, that sort of thing, and one thing the postmillennialists did do is they did achieve a lot of social reform, like cleaning up prisons and mental hospitals and things like that. And they were part of the temperance movement. Now, the original temperance movement was not total abstinence of alcohol. There was just so much drunkenness, they wanted kind of people to cut it back. And then eventually it goes into the prohibitionist movement. But Finney, I will say this, he preached against slavery, but he always preached in the North. Now, I would have admired him more if he'd gone to Alabama and preached against slavery before the Civil War, but anyway, but he did contribute to bringing on the Civil War because a lot of Northerners were thinking those Southerners are keeping Jesus from coming back, and all that. So all this stuff kind of goes together, but there was an area of New York where Charles Finney preached, they called the Burned Over District. And there's now I don't think this is true, but they said so many people were converted at these meetings that there was nobody else left to convert. It was burned over. It's kind of like, once you burn a field, you can go out and burn it again. It's already been burned, I don't think it was quite that effective. But the Second Great Awakening, it was a lot of stuff out on the frontier. You'd have what they called camp meetings, and people would camp out, and you'd have these preaching services like Cane Ridge, Kentucky. You had thousands of people would just camp out, and they would hear preaching night after night. And
Old Brush Arbors.
Yeah, that type of deal. You'd have the Baptist preachers over here, the Methodist preachers over here, and these people, Presbyterians, wherever you wanted to go. You could, all day long, you could go to hear preaching. This preacher, he finally winds down, so you go over and listen to this guy. You just circle around, and people bring, and they'd eat. Eating and dinner and all that kind of stuff. And there was some emotional ism. People would start barking like dogs, and stuff like that. The barking Baptists, I guess, and so forth. But
Hey, can we question them about them barking Baptists?
the meowing Methodists, and all that kind of stuff. But another thing that is kind of in this whole atmosphere in the early 1800s, there hadn't been a time like this where there was so much religious liberty. So anybody could come up with any idea they wanted to at that particular time. To an extent, we're going to talk about one group that didn't, but there was a Baptist preacher in New York named William Miller. And he got in his mind that Jesus was going to return on a particular day. And he figured it out, and I've read how he came up with this figure. But he was wrong a couple of times, and then he finally said, hey, I've miscalculated, I've got it now. It's October the 22nd, 1844, Jesus is going to come back. And I can remember when I was a little kid, my mother was telling me about when she talked to her grandmother, was telling her about her grandmother telling her about the time, and it must have been this, about the time when everybody across America thought Jesus was going to return. It says they made a pot of coffee, and they're sitting around waiting for Jesus to come back that night. Because William Miller said he's coming back, and he had 1 million followers across America. And you got to remember, the population was less than 30 million at that time. That's a lot of people. Well, hate to break it to you, Jesus did not return on that night. So I guess they had to make another pot of coffee or something. But he lost a lot of followers after Jesus didn't return, but he still had some. He eventually passes on, but some of his followers form what is now called the Seventh-day Adventist movement. Now, the Adventists had a lot of views that were close to Baptists, because that's what William Miller was, but they also had other views. that most Baptists don't have. I would say one of course, Seventh Day, they believe in have church on. But there were Seventh-day Baptists too, in addition to all these other kind of Baptists. Yeah, and there still are today. And so one of the things the Seventh-day Adventists believe that is probably outside of the mainstream of Christianity is most Christians believe that when you die, you go immediately to be with the Lord. That's what the Bible says. Okay, but they believe in something called soul sleep. That your soul sleeps until Jesus returns, and then you'll be and everything. But I guess it'd wind up being, because if you're dead, you're not going to know anything, and it's going to be like the next second. But that's a little bit different. One of the like a lot of groups, they have divisions. There's one group called the Branch Davidians, and the Branch Davidians, Ellen White was one of the leaders of the Seventh-day Adventist movement, and then you got Branch Davidians that come along. Does anybody know a famous group? A branch off the Branch Davidians was famous in Waco, Texas, here a few years ago.
Right.
Remember David Koresh? Okay, and so it would be unfair to blame that on the Seventh-day Adventists, or anything like that. But then you got the Cumberland Presbyterians. They dropped their beliefs in limited atonement and predestination. Okay. Christian perversions. This is all part of the Restoration movement, the Second Great Awakening. It's all this. It is estimated around 78% of Americans went to church weekly in the 1830s. So you can see there was this surge at that time. And people were looking for the true church. You got the Campbells. You've also got a group called the Mormons. Now, Joseph Smith, 1805 to 1844, was from New York. When he was a teenager, he got awakened one night, he said, by an angel in his room who told him that someday that he would translate this book about, and so eventually, he says, the angel led him out and he dug up these golden plates, and he couldn't read it. He said it was like an Egyptian hieroglyphics. Is anybody here able to read Egyptian hieroglyphics? Okay, well, he couldn't either, okay? And so he was saying, well, I can't read this. And said, got the thing for you. And he gave him some special glasses. And so the angel gave him, said, put these on. And he puts on the special glasses, and he can read, and all of a sudden it translates into English. Now, what was interesting about the English, this was the probably 20s, 30s. It translates into the English of the King James Version time period, and so he translates, and the Book of Mormon is so called because one of the principal characters is called Mormon. Okay, but and according to the Book of Mormon, after Jesus rose from the dead, remember there was 40 days before he ascended back to God. He was not always around. Remember, he would show up and then leave. Well, he was coming over here to America, according to the Book of Mormon, and preaching to the people that were here. And so there were, for want of a better word, the good Indians and the bad Indians, so to speak. And I don't know what American Indians today would think about this, but the bad Indians wiped out the good Indians. So if you've got any American Indian blood, you're descended from the bad Indians, okay? So, now it comes out, huh? Okay, but now they don't call themselves Mormons, they call themselves Latter-day Saints, because here's some of the things that were coming along at that time. In the 1800s, there was a widespread belief that the return of Jesus was imminent. Not just William Miller, but that all the post-millennial and then later on the dispensational, premillennial, there was a lot of emphasis on the end times. There hadn't been much for hundreds of years in Christianity, and now all of a sudden it was there. The Mormons moved to Missouri, where they were, to put it mildly, they weren't real welcome in the state of Missouri. In fact, the governor of Missouri issued an executive order that they could either leave or be exterminated. But the problem was is Joseph Smith, you know what he thought was in Missouri? The Garden of Eden. That's where it was. I bet y'all didn't know that. Probably around Branson, wouldn't you think? Well, I don't know. Well, yes.
Well, that's where I was born.
The Garden of Eden. So they go to Nauvoo, Illinois, and they set up, and so somehow Joseph Smith gets a lot of followers. And we don't have time to go through all that, but some of his doctrines were not very popular. First off, they said all other churches were corrupt. That doesn't make you very popular. Then he says that Mormons, there'll be, when you die, you go to different degrees of glory, and Mormons that follow the right path, they go to the highest degree of glory where you'll be God over your own planet. And they believe that God was created by another God, who was created by another God. I don't know how far back it was supposed to go, but and I said when Mitt Romney ran for president, I didn't really understand that. I mean, if he's going to be God over his own planet, why would he want to be president of the United States? That seems like kind of a nothing job, but I guess it's preparing you for that. But that kind of made him unpopular, and they were polytheistic, basically. And then he taught polygamy. That it's all right to have several wives. In fact, I think Joseph Smith had that 30 eventually. I don't know how you could.
You must have a good job.
Well, can you imagine the honey-do list, on a deal like that? But anyway, and some of Smith's followers said, "Hey, we're fed up with this." And they left the church, and they started had a printing press, and they started printing a newspaper attacking Joseph Smith and his beliefs. And then one night, the newspaper office went up in flames, and the printing press was destroyed. They suspected Joseph Smith. He was arrested, and a mob killed him. Basically, and him and some other leading Mormons. Brigham Young then took over the leadership of the movement and took them out to what is now Utah. And that was another split in the movement then, because Joseph Smith's son, I guess you have 30-something wives, you're liable to have a son in there somewhere. So anyway, there are other groups that descended from the Mormon movement as well. Jehovah's Witnesses also started in the 1800s. Part of this belief that the world's about to come to an end, again. But the Jehovah's Witnesses are really outside, I'd say, outside of the mainstream would kind of almost be an understatement. They deny the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ.
I also think he's Archangel Michael.
He's the Archangel Michael. They deny the doctrine of the Trinity, and so forth. And if you ever have a Jehovah's Witness come to your house, some people, they like to insult Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't know why they like to do that. That's what they want. They think they go back and say, "Hey, we got insulted 42 times today." That's an achievement. So I'm always real nice to them because I don't want to give them an achievement like that.
You don't want them to have merit badges?
Yeah. Let's look at, skip down to, we're about to run out of time here, Pentecostalism.
That clock is fast, though.
Oh, is it? Well, I've got, yeah, it's a little bit fast. 1899, Charles Fox Parham of Kansas said that the evidence of sanctification, you remember that you're saved, justification, and then you go sanctification. Well, he believed the evidence that you were being sanctified, the second work of grace, was the baptism of the Holy Spirit, which was evidenced by speaking in tongues or other languages. There was a slow growth in this until the Azusa Street Revival was held in the early 1900s in Los Angeles, California. After all good Christian movements come out of Los Angeles, don't they? I mean, that's... the interesting thing about this Azusa Street Revival is that it included people from all kinds of churches and included a lot of different, black people as well as white people, and it was that was one thing very early on. The Pentecostal movement was really didn't have much distinctions on like some of the other churches had on race. Out of this movement came the Church of God in Christ, which is both Pentecostal and holiness. Pentecostal means the gifts of the Spirit.
They're a black denomination too.
Yeah. And the Assemblies of God come along in 1914, which de-emphasized the holiness teaching, but they're very Pentecostal. Now, I'm interested about the Assemblies of God is that they have the Baptists had royal ambassadors, the Assemblies of God had royal rangers, and so they had they took a lot of the Southern Baptist stuff and adapted it, which is fine. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel every time, I guess.
They did the same thing with Sunday school.
Yeah, and they. The United Pentecostal Church and the Foursquare Gospel Church and so on. Now, the Charismatic movement was the introduction of Pentecostal elements into traditionally non-Pentecostal churches. And so this was real big, I would say, in the 60s and 70s. You would have seen this a lot of Baptist churches, Methodist, Catholic. Would have charismatic movements within those churches. You don't see that as much anymore. It's not as prevailing thing. But one of the things that the charismatic movement contributed greatly to was the growth of non-denominational storefront churches, what they sometimes call box churches, where you don't really have a lot of Sunday schools and that sort of thing. In recent years, we've had the rise of the TV and radio preachers, a variety of backgrounds and styles. Some of them, I would say, are a lot more orthodox than others. I heard it when I was a kid. I heard this guy on the radio back in the 60s. He said, his radio preacher, he said, send him $1. Of course, $1 was a lot more money back in the 60s. Send him $1 and he'd send you an autographed picture of Jesus Christ, and stuff like that. And man, I didn't have $1, Just think what I could have had,
Or he'd send you a hanky.
And all that touched the radio and stuff like that. So you've got good and bad. Jerry Falwell, the Old Time Gospel Hour, and Pat Robertson. One of the things that Falwell and Robertson did was a lot of the fundamentalist, dispensational, premillennialist people tended to not be as involved in politics because the thinking was, the world's going to get worse and worse. Jesus is going to return and everything. And probably what made the difference here, they got Jerry Falwell and a lot of these guys involved, was the Roe v. Wade decision. When the Supreme Court said all laws against abortion are unconstitutional.
And Pat Robertson backslid and run for president.
Yeah, and then he really did it, you know. So, Billy Graham was the most prominent evangelist in America in the last half of the 20th century. He, without going into the whole story of Billy Graham, because that'd take a long time, he was one of many that had these tent revivals. And, you know, we don't have that much anymore, but that used to be a part of American Christianity, you know, was the tent revivals. And he did that too. And he finally decided he would go to Los Angeles and have the great Los Angeles Crusade of 1949. And so they go out there, and he's preaching, and he's being very successful. And one of the great mob bosses of the West Coast came forward and became a Christian during this service. And that made the news. And William Randolph Hearst, who owned a chain of newspapers in the United States, heard about that, and he said, we need to really push this. This is a great story. And so Billy Graham became very prominent across America at that time. And of course television comes along, and you could watch him on TV, as well as had great impact on American Christianity, obviously, Billy Graham. Okay, the European decline of Christianity, basically that's what I'd have to say, is it's been declining, except for little good points there. The Welsh Revival, 1904, the work of Charles Spurgeon in the 1800s. He was the prince of preachers in London, had hundreds, thousands of people come to hear him preach. He got involved in fighting against the growing modernist, liberal, whatever you want to call it, movement in his day. Now, I will say that he, today, when people think of Baptists, a lot of people think of things we don't do, and that type of deal. That used to be Methodists, that people thought of things Methodists didn't do, and Baptists were a little bit more open, type of thing. And so Methodists, the holiness movement and so on, back in the 1800s, the Methodists were among the first to preach against smoking, tobacco. Well, Charles Spurgeon smoked cigars, okay? And so one of the leading Methodist preachers in London visited him one time, says, Mr. Spurgeon says, I just wonder, do you think it's right to smoke cigars? And he says, well, I guess it's okay as long as you don't smoke to excess. And the Methodist preacher said, what would be excess? And he said, well, if I was smoking more than one cigar at a time, then that would be excessive, okay? But today it's kind of like that's the thing is, no tobacco and no smoking, but, all that stuff like open-toed shoes or, and all that kind of stuff. What's right and what's wrong, and there's a lot of cultural things there.
Churches over the years have had to kill a lot of sacred cows.
Oh, yeah. Now, one last thing I did want to just kind of touch on is one thing we've had, and I would say this is largely since the Second World War, is what I call the intellectual Christian movement, apologetics, where, most time, you had preachers, they'd preach in their churches, or that had their revivals, or their all that sort of thing. These are guys that are not necessarily even ministers of the gospel, but they're Christian apologists. That means they make the intellectual arguments for Christianity. And if you've ever heard C.S. Lewis, for example, is an example of that. Lee Strobel, The Case for Christ. William Lane Craig, Norman Geisler, Frank Turek, Josh McDowell, N.T. Wright. I could go on a lot of different names of people that are in that movement, and they had their role as well. And
they're not Christians.
Those are not ministers.
Oh, not ministers.
Generally, they're not ministers of the.
Wright was a bishop.
Do what now?
N.T. Wright was a bishop.
Yeah, N.T. Wright is a bishop, over there in England. So I mean,
You know
but
what? It's absolutely amazing how God can take these guys, whether they're right or wrong, and still get people saved.
oh yeah,